All right, so introduction, 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 10 is what we want to get this morning. We are right on schedule with the class. And we've got some space built in at the end anyways if we fall behind. Not a big deal. All right, so when we look at this is going to be an introduction not only to 1 John, it's going to be an introduction to 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, okay? To a certain extent, it's an introduction, in a very brief way, to literature from the hand of John, all right? John the Apostle writes 5 books in the New Testament. What are they? Give me one, David Ziegler. John, and you mean the Gospel of John? Absolutely. Give me another one, Anna. 1 John, good. Give me another one, Jordan. 2 John, okay. Tim, give me another one. 3 John, okay. John, you're going to give me the last one. The book of Revelation, very good. Those are our 5 books from the Apostle John. And it forms a body of literature. There's actually a technical term for that, but I'm not sure I can say it right, so I'm not even going to try, okay? But his literature collectively forms a body of literature in the New Testament. We have that from Peter as well. We have 1 and 2 Peter. And then we have, really the big writer of the New Testament is who? Paul, okay? So we know a lot more about things that come from his hand than really anyone else, but John runs a very close second to that because we have so much from him. All right, so, excuse me, looking at John's writings. First of all, when we look at 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, the author is not stated explicitly in any of these letters. So why do we call them 1st, 2nd, and 3 John? There is the question. Because none of them say John 2, all right? We see that some, but we don't see, we see that in some letters in the New Testament. We don't see that in these, okay? In the book of Revelation, it's stated explicitly, okay? It's stated that it's John. We have to kind of work the circuit around to realize that it's John the Apostle. We kind of have to do that with these as well. 1st, 2nd John, 1st, 2nd, and 3 John in Revelation use much similar language. And the result of that has been that the natural conclusion by most people is that they share the same author. Is it 100%? It is not, okay? There are people out there that believe 2nd and 3rd John were actually written by someone else who is simply referred to as an elder named John, who was in the same rough geographical area. But the vast majority of people over the centuries have assigned all of these books to the same author. So, for example, we have early Christian writers such as Dionysius of Alexandria. He will not be on the test, okay? He lives in the 3rd century. Tertullian, who lives in the 2nd and 3rd century, AD. All of these are AD, of course. And then we have Irenaeus, who lives in the 2nd century. All of these men considered John and 1 John to have been from the apostle. 2nd and 3rd John is a little bit more complex. And so we have that reference there in 2 John verse 1, 3 John verse 1 to an elder, okay? Perhaps that is someone other than the Apostle John, but I'm kind of the opinion that unless there's some overarching reason, earth-shattering reason to rock the boat of what people have generally believed concerning authorship, I'm just going to go with the authorship that most over the centuries have taken, and most over the centuries have taken these to be works from the Apostle John. No question about the gospel, and I really think there's no question about Revelation. There really is not any question about 1 John. 2 John and 3 John are the only two that have some questions there about that, and that's probably because we have the reference there to the elder, okay, rather than a name, all right? So, let's move on looking at these things. Dating the letters, dating really all of John's literature is actually interesting because it all dates so much later on than the rest of the literature that we have in the New Testament. They're dated towards the end of the 1st century. So these are the last writings of the New Testament, presumably, again, given what we've talked about authorship, presumably from the last living apostle. All right, it's John who is the last living apostle. John writes these works, and they are all written towards the end of the 1st century. If you've been in my Revelation class, you know that I date Revelation to what year? About 96 AD. The Gospel of John is written roughly in the same time period. If we went a little bit wider, we could say 80 on forward. Okay, 80 AD forward, but I think it's probably closer to the late 80s. early to mid-90s. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are all written in that same time frame. So it's very, very late compared to Paul. Paul's writings all date at an end point to when? Mid-60s, because Paul dies, okay? Paul dies in the mid-60s, and so all of his works are written before that. Peter's works, we talked about that. When does Peter die? Mid-60s, so his works end at that point in time as well. Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, when are they all written? Early in the time of the church, okay? Obviously not early in the 1st century, because they couldn't be written before Jesus lived or before all those things happened. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all early Gospels. John is a much later gospel. It dates to this later period. And by the way, when you talk about the Gospels, you talk about the synoptic Gospels. What are the synoptic Gospels? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why are they synoptic? Lots of similarities, lots of shared materials, okay? You get to the Gospel of John, and John is really different, okay? The Gospel of John is really different from the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, okay? That's very different than what you find when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is not a synoptic gospel. It shares some material with the Gospels. It has a lot of other stuff that the other Gospels don't have. And what we have in the Gospel of John is a whole lot of Jesus' discourses, okay? So a studying of the Gospel of John involves studying those discourses. Tom, did you have a question?
Were they all written in, Revelation was written in Patmos for first, second John? I think they were written there all.
We're going to look at that in just a second. I need a mic guy. Who's my mic guy? Tim, you're my mic guy. So if you'll just see, this is how I get rid of Tim. Tim, if you sit right here in front of me, I'm going to make you the mic guy every single time. All right. So Tim, if you'll take that last seat over there. I'm sneaky. So Tim, if you'll just somewhere at the back there, make yourself comfortable. If you got a question or comment, raise your hand and we will make Tim walk. So you get all our steps in this way or something like that. All right. So dated towards the end of the 1st century, presumably from the last living apostle. Let's talk about the place of composition. There we go. Generally, it is believed that John lived in Ephesus. And remember, we're going on the assumption that all of these come from the apostle John. Generally, it is believed that John lived in Ephesus at the end of his life, except for the time of his exile to the island of Patmos. Specifically, he gets one of his books on the island of Patmos. Which one is that? Revelation, okay? All of these could have been written while on Patmos, but when it comes to the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, it's really hard to make any conclusions. With Revelation, it's clear because he says so, okay? He's on the island of Patmos when he receives the revelation. Now, I will say this. Does that mean that he had to have written it while he was still on Patmos? Not necessarily. He could have written it when he got off the island and got to go back to Ephesus. But I think generally it's safer to say that he wrote it while he was on the island because he's receiving the vision and he's writing it down. So that's about as good as we can get with the place of composition, is that they're at least from that area, even if we can't pinpoint it more exactly than that. Okay? The recipients of John's letters are John's addresses, John's literature. All of these are addressed to Christians. Okay? That's not unusual. New Testament books are, by and large, all addressed to Christians. Okay? Now, the Gospels are written for Christians, but they're also for cultural groups. Okay? So when you get to the Gospel of John, you have at the end of that John says, these things are written so that you may believe. That could be addressed to Christians or non-Christians. But when you get to 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, those things are written to Christians. Okay? Certainly, if you move beyond the Gospels themselves and you're looking at the epistles and you're looking at the book of Revelation, they are addressed to Christians. That's the intended group of recipients. All right? The book of 1 John is a general epistle. There are no specific recipients. Okay? John doesn't say this is to the Christians living in Asia Minor. Does Peter do that? Okay, we get a head nodding over here. Yeah, Peter does that, okay? Peter addresses his letter to Christians living in a geographical area that today is mostly Turkey, okay? 2 John is addressed to the elect lady and her children. Now, that's either an actual woman with her household. If you take it literally, that's who you would have. There is some Christian lady out there with children, and John writes this letter to her. If you take the symbolic approach, then it is written to a local church or for the church in general. Go ahead, ask me what I think. I think it's symbolic. Okay, I think it's addressed to either to a congregation or to congregations. I don't think it is addressed to I don't think it's addressed to Lydia of Thyatira, okay? I think it's addressed to a congregation. Why would we use language like a woman and children? What is the church? The bride of Christ, okay? So the church is very natural to refer to the church as a woman, okay? If you wanted to argue about that, say, no, it's literal, okay, all right. I'm not going to argue with you about that. I really don't think when we get to the day of judgment and we're waiting to go in through the pearly gates, if you will. I'm being very accommodative here. I do not think that Peter is going to stop us or anyone's going to stop us and say, Shelley, you thought it was symbolic. Too bad, you're out of here, okay? But we can differ on this approach a little bit. Probably in times past when I was a lot younger, I took it to be a literal woman with her children. I don't think we have to take it that way. 3 John is addressed to someone whose name was Gaius. Gaius is otherwise unknown, but the situation of this letter indicates a situation in a specific congregation. We will get to, okay, Tim, you got your first mic opportunity over here. It's going to be Andrew. Gaius is not someone, over this way, Andrew. It's written to an individual, but it describes a situation going on in a congregation. All right, so Andrew?
So this might be a better question for when we get to 2 John, but is there any evidence within the epistle itself that backs up that it is symbolic language?
Nope. I don't see anything that would back it up one way or the other. So it depends upon if we want to take it literally or not. So there is the conundrum, okay? If there was some clear evidence, then we wouldn't have that discussion. But there really isn't clear evidence. And so people have gone this way, people have gone that way on that. I suspect Christians have gone this way and that way on it. It's just not, it doesn't change what we learn from the letter. So it doesn't really affect in any kind of material way. I mean, it's a very short letter, so there's very little information. 3 John is different because 3 John has enough information to tell us that it is being addressed to a specific situation happening in a specific church. Because we get some men who are named by name. We get a fellow whose name is, anybody know who's the big guy in 3 John? Diotrephes. If you've not heard that name before, you'll get to hear it in class because there's a situation in that church, in that group of Christians, that church, that John's addressing. So we don't get that in 2 John, not in any clear way, not that could make it clear cut. So thank you, good comment. All right, so some photographs to share with y'all. This is Ephesus. It's part of Ephesus. The ruins of Ephesus are very large. I could not find one photo that would encompass everything. Okay, Ephesus was a very large city in the ancient world. In the first century, it was a very large city. So we have a couple of letters addressed to the Ephesians. What's the first letter addressed to the Ephesians? I gave it away. What is it? Ephesians. Okay, Ephesians is addressed to the Ephesians. Who writes Ephesians? Paul. What's the second letter addressed to the Ephesians? Specifically, in Revelation, one of Jesus' 7 messages is addressed specifically to the church in Ephesus. Okay? It seems to be, at least it seems to me, that the tradition concerning John's location at the end of his life is pretty accurate. That he is in Ephesus, he is in this area. The book of Revelation, it's addressed to 7 churches in Asia, in a very small area right there where he's at. I mean, those churches in Revelation, they're not spread out all over the place. It's not like there's one here in Spain, there's one here in Italy, there's one here in Asia, there's one down there in Judea. They are in a very compact geographical area, okay? I don't know exactly how many miles apart they are, but I suspect that if you went on a tour of the 7 cities of those 7 churches, you could probably do it in a car. If you didn't stay very long at each place, you could probably do it in one day. If you stayed a little while, it might take you a couple of days to do that. They are geographically very close together. Seems, again, good indication that that tradition that we have that John is living the last years of his life in Ephesus is pretty good. Another photograph from Ephesus. This might give you an idea of the scale. I know the other one was aerial. This is on the ground. You see those people way off in the distance, okay, on the what would be the right side of the photograph, okay? That gives you a scale. This is monumental architecture, okay? This is one of the streets in Ephesus. The stones there, by the way, what are those stones? Anybody have an idea? I don't even know what travertine is. I was looking for the kind of rock. Marble. They're marble, okay? Those street, as far as I understand, that's made out of marble, okay? So it's expensive material. It has lasted a long time there in Ephesus. But that's one part of the city of Ephesus. Ephesus was a wealthy city. It was a seaport in the first century. It's no longer a seaport. If you've been to Ephesus, the ocean is several miles distant because the river has silted up. Okay?
That's the main drag that takes you to the library.
Okay, the main drag that takes you to the library. Tom and Linda have been there. Stacy, you've been there? Who else has been to Ephesus? Anybody? We got our 3 world travelers here that have been. Okay, one of these days, maybe I'll make it there. Or maybe not, but we'll see. Okay, another photograph to share with y'all. This is also from Ephesus. These are the ruins of St. John's Basilica. And that square there in the middle, you can't see it in that photograph, but there's a sign on part of that. This is the traditional burial site of the Apostle John. Okay, by tradition, he is buried in this place. How valid is that tradition? Hard to say. The basilica itself was built during the years 527 to 565. That's a good 400 years after the time of John. However, it was built on the site of an older church, which was supposedly the burial site of John. Okay, that John died in Ephesus is probably pretty sure. That he's buried in this spot, maybe so, maybe no. Okay, traditional sites are always kind of a little. They're not always iffy. Some of them are actually pretty good. Some of them are completely wrong, okay? This one is one of those that you really can't say because there is some older evidence than the basilica that it was from that time. By the way, how many of y'all have seen pictures of the huge mosque in Istanbul called, we call it Hagia Sophia. I think the Muslims call it something different. How many of y'all have seen, you may have seen it with your own eyes. How many have seen pictures of it? It is like the landmark in Istanbul, okay? That was a mosque that was converted from a church that was built at the same time as this. So this basilica was monumental architecture. It was built under the Byzantine Empire, that eastern part of the Roman Empire. And so it was truly monumental in the day. Now it's just ruins, all right? Perhaps it's where the Apostle John is buried. By the way, anybody happen to know who else is believed to have spent the last days of his or her life in Ephesus? Mary. Okay, remember at the cross, Jesus says what to John? That's right. You take care of my mom, is what he's saying. Okay? And Mary is taken into his household from that time forward. So if she lived long enough, if she lived to an old age, to live to the time when John moves to Ephesus, it is entirely possible that that's actually a true tradition as well. Hard to say whether that is accurate or not. All right, so another photograph to share with y'all. I like sharing photos when I can. This is a baptistry constructed before the rest of the basilica. So when they're building this, one of the first things they build is a baptistry. Then they build a basilica, okay? I want you to note this is built in the early 500s AD. How are they practicing baptism in Ephesus at that time? Immersion, okay? You don't build something like that if you're just going to sprinkle or pour water on a baby. You do that if you're immersing adults, okay? By the way, this is not the only place that you see that evidence. We actually see it a lot of places in the Mediterranean. Ivana and I were able, many years ago, we went down to northern Italy to visit with the Christians that live there. And we actually were able to see an example of a large baptistry like that in northern Italy. So it was a long time before infant sprinkling became the standard practice. This is in Ephesus. You can see the nice steps down into that, and there's plenty of room to baptize and come back up out of the water. Stacy, Tim, if you will bring the mic over here to Stacy.
there's actually another basilica within Rome that does have a baptistry that's created in the shape of a Greek cross. So you step down into it from one of the arms of the cross, you go up out of it with the other arm of the Greek cross. And that was built sometime between 300 and 500.
Okay, all right. So in Rome you see this. I mean, these are really, you see these. If you know what you're looking for and you visit really, really old churches, you will see these, okay, in the Mediterranean world. It's interesting that it's in the form of a cross. You step in like that. Here you don't have that. I'm not sure what those other holes are in the ground, but you don't have that form. But it's an interesting concept, the idea of making it in the form of a cross, because biblically speaking, what does baptism do? It's a reenactment of what Jesus did. It's a reenactment of his death, his burial, and his resurrection. So neat symbolism that they would do it in the form of a cross. You go in, you're immersed, and you come out. Okay? All right. Another photograph, just so we don't leave Patmos off. This is a photograph of Patmos, current day, present day. Patmos in the ancient world, when John is exiled there, would not have been that populated. Okay? He was exiled there for a reason. Okay? So, likely recipients of John's letters, all right there within that purple circle. Certainly the book of Revelation is. Probably the Gospel of John is intended for that geographical area, at least originally, okay? And the first, second, and third letters are intended to that area as well, because that's the area that he's living. With Paul, it's different, because Paul goes all over the place preaching and establishing churches, and so when he writes letters, who's he writing to? Exactly. Usually the churches he's established, or at least in the area of churches that he's established. There's a connection there with those folks. Okay? If we assume that John is doing the same thing, his letters are certainly being addressed to folks in that area. All right? We know the book of Revelation is, because it specifies it. The others do not. All right, let's look on. So some problems that are dealt with or addressed in the first, second, and third letter of John. Now we're kind of focusing in a little bit. One of the things that's addressed is remaining faithful. Okay, this is a big topic in the New Testament, because remaining faithful is an important concept. It is still an important concept today. Okay, what is the number one problem? The number one problem that churches have today? Helping the members remain faithful, okay? That is the number one problem. The number two problem, and maybe these go right hand in hand together on the rankings chart, would be how to convert other people, okay? Bringing other people to the Lord. But from an internal standpoint, it's about keeping people faithful, okay? And these letters are written, one of the problems they address is remaining faithful to Jesus, okay? The problems in the first century, you had persecutions, okay? That's what the book of Revelation is about, okay? So remain faithful during persecution. Remain faithful when the world calls you. The world of the first century was not unlike our own. There was a whole lot of sin out there that was very attractive, okay? Sometimes Christians fall away from the Lord because they like that old lifestyle. They want to go back to what they did before they were Christians. They want to live in ways that they lived before they were Christians. And so that draws them back. Persecution is not such a big problem for us here in America today. Could be someday, but it isn't today. All right? So you got the world calling people back. And then the other problem that is a problem for Christians is, anybody throw an idea out there? False teaching, okay, addressed heavily in 1st and 2nd Peter. Also, it's going to be addressed heavily here in the writings of John. Think about the letters to the 7 churches. One of the issues that's addressed is your love has just gotten weak or cold or whatever, okay? It's very interesting to me that when you look at the Christian's relationship to Christ, it parallels the relation between husbands and wives. I mean, we have a saying, don't we? Midlife crisis. What do guys do when they hit that midlife crisis? They either get a really fast car. What? They get a purple car. Yeah, David has a purple car. If y'all did not know that, it's TCU purple. I think somebody should go out there with some crimson paint and paint it a different color. Right, Delilah? At least half of it. They get a fast car, or they get a new wife. Preferably a younger one. You know, you trade in the minivan for a sports car. You trade in the middle-aged wife for a newer model. This is so ubiquitous that it's proverbial that people do this. All right? What do you do to get people, first of all, if it's the fast car, you say, man, that's a really ugly purple car you got there, but I'm glad you like it. There's nothing sinful about having a purple car, but if you trade in your wife for a newer model, you need to deal with the sin that's happening there. But usually, when we talk about a midlife crisis, usually there's something underlying that. The underlying that is that sometimes married couples have just gotten kind of complacent where they are. It's described in the book of Revelation as you have left your first love. Okay? So there's a lot of parallels between how the church relates to Christ with how husbands and wives relate to each other in a marriage. All right? We get some people. We got some folks here. How long y'all been married? 47 years. How long y'all been married, Charlotte? 60-something? Okay, we'll go with that. All right. Tom and Linda? 42. Okay. The world around us looks at people that have been married 60-something, 47, 42, and they say, wow, how is that even possible? Because a lot of marriages don't last nearly that long. And so it's really something when people do. I can't pick on anybody this morning. I'm not going to. I will tell you, Ivana and I have been married 30 in August. And I will also tell you, we have the most wonderful marriage. We have never had any rocky spots. There has never been a time when I have looked over at her in the morning and said, oh, I really don't have to spend a whole lot of time with you today. That's just never happened. We've never said, it'd be good if you went shopping at, Walmart by yourself and I'll go somewhere else by mine. We've never done any of that. I've also got a bridge in Arizona to sell you. In Arizona. There have been times in our marriage when things have been pretty rough. There have been times when, yes, I can only speak for myself. I didn't really care if I spent the day with Ivana that day. And I can assure you there were times when she didn't care if she spent the day with me. But we're still plugging along because you move beyond those things. All right? And I suspect some of y'all that have been married many, many more years than we have had those kinds of days as well. But you never left your first love. Because if you had, and you hadn't corrected it, you wouldn't still be together. Okay? So, remaining faithful is an important concept in these letters. John is now writing to Christians who are in the second generation, sometimes the third generation. The churches in these areas have been established now. If you take Paul, his journeys through here, they were established in the 60s. John is now writing in the 90s. That's a 30-year difference. 30 years is as long as Ivana and I have been married. That's a long time. We've got now our children and the first grandchild. Okay? Will they remain faithful? Will the grandchildren remain faithful? Time will tell. Okay? People do fall away. Our family members fall away. Sometimes our children fall away. Our grandchildren fall away. John is addressing churches here that are already in the second and third generation. The other thing that's being addressed, it's already been mentioned, false doctrines are arising among Christians. We saw that in 1st and 2nd Peter. We're going to see it more visible in these letters, even if we don't focus too terribly much on it in the class. The rise and growth of Gnosticism. When Peter's writing in the mid-60s, it's just beginning. By the time John is writing in the latter part of the 1st century, it is now well on its way to being established. Gnosticism is going to be a problem. I will just say this, and I thought this was very interesting. The Greek word know, or our English word know, I'm going to take the English translation, it appears in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, little short books, 39 times. It appears in the Gospel of John and Revelation together 121 times. So if you take the literature of John, you get 160 times that word know appears. In the remainder of the entire New Testament, it appears another 276 times. So the other Gospels, all of John's letters, the book of Acts, okay, that word know translates a Greek word and group of words, gnosis, knowledge. See the connection? Gnosticism. The Gnostics said, we've got special knowledge. We've been specially enlightened. John writes in his literature, these things are written so that you may know. Okay, so look for that word as we read these letters. You're going to see it 39 times in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Okay, Tim, we have at least one comment over here, maybe two. Stacy, and then Mary, did you have a question or a comment? Nope, I just saw a hand.
So mine is a question. So there's a cult called Mithras from Persia that moved into Asia, Italy, and it was a mystery cult, a thing about knowledge, that sort of thing. Is it possible that that influences some of this, the rise of Gnosticism?
Okay. The cult of Mithras is present in the Roman Empire at this time. Probably doesn't affect these letters because the cult of Mithras had a very special following. Roman soldiers. Roman soldiers were really big in that cult. Okay, and it did come from Persia. Now, did the Gnostics borrow from it? Probably. I could not say 100%, but the Gnostics were pretty good at borrowing something from everybody. Okay, if it looks good, we'll take it. The rest of it we'll leave. So they will take things from Judaism, things from Christianity. They'll take things from Greek philosophy and Greek religion and kind of put it all together. And there are different forms of Gnosticism. Does Gnosticism still exist today? It does, okay? Kind of in a different form than what we see in the ancient world, but that kind of idea has continued on. But no, probably not a direct connection here with that. Then the other thing that's dealt with is attempts to change church structure, particularly 3rd John deals with that. We talk about Diotrephes. What's going on with Diotrephes is an attempt to change church structure of a local congregation. Okay? And so John is going to deal with that. All right. So an outline of 1 John. That introduction went longer than I intended it to. I am sorry for that. Outline of 1 John.
Stephen, I have a question real quick. Did you actually give the definition of Gnosticism? Because if I did, I missed it. I just wanted to know the definition.
Okay, the definition of Gnosticism, here it is. You ready? It's a religion of the first 3 centuries that borrowed a whole lot of stuff from other folks, usually with the idea of we have special knowledge. Gnosticism is hard to define because it was on a spectrum. There was a spectrum of beliefs in Gnosticism. That's why when we find different works of literature that are Gnostic, they're sometimes touted as like the Gospel of Judas. We've talked about that in class, okay? The Gospel of Judas has nothing to do with Judas. Judas didn't write it. Nobody who knew Judas wrote it, okay? It just got that title because some Gnostic somewhere saw that story of Jesus and said, boy, there's a whole lot we don't know about Judas. Let's fill in the blanks. And so he writes it. Then you have the Gospel of Thomas. There's another Gnostic work. There's a whole bunch of these, and they come from different groups. Trying to pin down Gnosticism, you can get general ideas, but trying to be very specific to what they actually believe really depends upon who you're talking about. Because there were sects within Gnosticism. But the idea generally was, you can get some ideas that are pretty consistent. The idea generally was we have knowledge. We have special knowledge that other folks don't have. So let us enlighten you. Okay? That's why in English we call it Gnosticism, because it comes from that Greek word to know, gnosis. Okay? I wish I could pin it down more than that, but you just can't. It's just too broad of a group, and sometimes we don't know a lot about what the groups actually believed, and sometimes what we know about them we have from their opponents. And who were the big opponents of Gnosticism, by the way, in the first 3 centuries? Christians. Okay? Christians, because other groups didn't really care. Okay, if you were a Roman, if you followed the Roman gods, and you wanted to worship an Egyptian god, whatever. If you wanted to worship Mithras was a little bit eyed with suspicion because it was a mystery cult. Okay, mystery religion, and because it was so influential in the Roman army. So it was eyed with a little bit more suspicion. But generally speaking, the Romans didn't care. Worship anyone and everyone, doesn't matter. But when the Gnostics started taking things out of Christianity, then there needed to be a response to that, especially as Gnostics tried to infiltrate churches. Because sometimes it was easy to do because they used the same language. We're not going to get into verses 1 through 10, so I'm already, let's look at that. I was right on time for one class, now I'm behind again. No big deal. Just say this. 2 young men knock on your door. Dressed very nicely. They have little black name tags. You invite them in for discussion. 2 women or men, or maybe a man and a woman, knock on your door. Not dressed they might be dressed nicely, but not with little name badges. Okay? You invite them in. Talking about the Mormons on one hand, the Jehovah's Witnesses on the other. They use very often the exact same terminology we do. Ask a Jehovah's Witness, do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? They will answer yes to that question. But their terminology has different definitions. Okay? What they mean when they say they believe that Jesus is the Son of God is not what I mean when I say I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So the words are the same, but the dictionary is different. They use a different dictionary. And they're very good at this. So that has allowed them, certainly the Mormon Church and even the Jehovah's Witnesses, to be kind of accepted by and large as a Christian group. They are not even remotely similar to Christianity, except that they use some of the things that look the same, some of the words that sound the same, but they mean different things. Particularly when you get to Mormonism and you start talking to Mormons about what they really believe, becomes abundantly clear that religion is not what I find in the Bible. Not in the Old Testament, not in the New Testament. Okay, so for example, you ever wondered why Mormons practice polygamy? Now you're looking at me and saying, well, they don't practice polygamy anymore. You're right, they don't here on earth. But they do have spiritual marriages performed in their temples. And yes, Mormon men can be spiritually bound to multiple women. Why is that? What difference does it make when you die and enter eternity, whether you got one wife or 10? Biblically speaking, by the way, how many do you have in eternity? None, okay? Because in Mormon theology, the belief is that if you are a faithful Mormon and you are male, eventually you will become the god of your new world. And you will populate your new world. And the more wives you have, the more quicker you can populate it. Wow. They don't share that with you at the front door, do they? But if you dig in, you find it, okay? And so that explains a lot of things that happen. Why are temples so important? By the way, can you and I walk into a Mormon temple? The answer to that is no, we cannot, okay? To go inside a Mormon temple, you have to be a bona fide member of the Mormon church. We don't prevent anybody from walking in here during services and joining us, but if I wanted to go into a temple, I got to be a Mormon, okay? Because that's where all of these things take place. And so the temple is special ground. Temples. I don't know if they have one in Dallas or not, but I think they may be talking about building one in Dallas, okay? Because they're really, really important for these things. Well, they use our terminology. They talk about baptism. They talk about salvation. They talk about Jesus. They talk about God. They would say there's one God, but that's not really what they believe because they mean something different. The Gnostics are that way. They would use Christian terminology, but they would mean something different. So it was easy for them to infiltrate congregations. That's why these things are written, so that Christians will be aware and will be able to refute then these false doctrines when they pop up. Okay? So these are some things. This is 1 John, life with God and the world, chapter 1 through 5, verse 5 through 227. These outlines are just for your benefit later. God's love for us and our love for one another. testing the spirits and trusting God. So that whole idea of testing the spirits, okay? Where are they from? What are they teaching? Okay? And the idea there is testing people, okay? Not a spiritual being as such, but testing people. All right, so if we had more than the next 25 seconds, we would cover 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. We do not, so we will not, okay? So what I need for you all to do, bear with me just a second. I want to give you your assignment. I want you to read verses 1 through 10. And then for Wednesday night, read chapter 2, verses 1 through 17. Now, how many of you realistically think we're going to cover all of that Wednesday night? Good, I don't see any hands. Realistically, we're not. We're probably just going to cover 1 through 10. But go ahead and read Sorry. You get to see the ocean in California instead. Instead, make sure you read 1 John chapter 2, verses 1 through 17 in case we get into that Wednesday night. All right? Thank you all.